Last week, we began looking at constitutional amendments on the Florida ballot. To help you understand them, the way they're written can be somewhat complicated. That would be an understatement. Our political analyst, Robert Watson, head of the American Studies program at Lynn University, back with his ballot in plain English. We pick up where we left off. We went amendments 1 through 6. We'll show you where you can find them on the web later. Now we pick up and move on.
Sure. Quick word before we jump into that. There's very long lines, as we heard in your first segment, in part perhaps because of an uptick in voter turnout, in part perhaps because we removed early voting from 14 down to 8 days, but also perhaps because of these amendments. There's almost a dozen of them on there. Very long, very wordy, very complicated. So let's jump in. There is no number 7 on the ballot. 7 was originally thrown out by the High Court. They allowed the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, to rewrite it. Right. And 7 has become 8. That's the religious freedom. What it does is it would remove, now it's kind of complicated because some people say if you want religious freedom, you should vote no. On the other hand, it removes the no aid provision. And that is we cannot give public taxpayer money to religious organizations. Right. So it would remove that. People that oppose this tend to fall in 2 camps. One, folks that just want that separation between church and state. They don't want politics and religion and politics. Number 2, folks see it as a thinly veiled effort to promote vouchers that taxpayer money goes to religious institutions. Supporters of it tend to be folks that prefer the whole array of religious issues in politics. And secondly, those folks that do support vouchers being given to religious schools, such as the Conference on Catholic Bishops.
Then we move on to the homestead property tax exemption, correct?
Yes, what this is number 9. This is for surviving spouses. What it would do would provide a homestead tax exemption for a surviving spouse in 2 cases. If you are active duty military and your spouse dies in the line of combat or in duty, or secondly, if you're the spouse of a first responder and the first responder is lost in the line of duty, so it would extend that. That's number 9.
And I want to talk about number 10 and then both of them together, because we talked last week about the implications of changing tax policy. While certainly you talk about surviving spouses of a military veteran or first responder, how important that could be, there are some implications there. But let's move on to number 10, because in some ways the next 2 amendments really tie into this whole question about our tax base in the future. So number 10.
This is a personal property tax exemption. What it does is we currently have a personal property tax exemption for businesses at $25,000, up to the first $25,000. This would essentially double it, move it to $50,000. The key is tangible property. This is stuff businesses use to make money, like machines and tools and signs. They can now claim that up to $50,000, so it would double that, in theory helping small businesses.
Let's move on to our next one, an additional homestead exemption?
Yeah, this is for senior citizens. There is a homestead exemption, but they want to provide an additional homestead exemption if you fit a couple criteria. 1, you have to be a senior citizen over the age of 65. 2, you have to have lived in your house for 25 years. 3, you need to make under 27 grand a year or have an income less than $27,000 a year. And 4th and finally, your home has to be valued at $250,000 or less.
Now let's talk about all of the amendments on the ballot that relate to taxes. Any of them on their face, you say, wow, an additional homestead exemption to help surviving spouses. You talk about caps on taxes in some of the amendments. The upside and downside debates of all this. We saw this in California many years ago. When propositions, I believe Prop 78 put on the ballot back in the 70s, started limiting taxes. Many argue that California is now, because of constitutional amendments approved by voters, has tied itself in knots on spending and revenue. What's the upside downside of the debate in Florida?
That's the argument here, and you're absolutely right. Some of these amendments, such as the health care amendment, the abortion amendment, which we discussed last week, the religious freedom amendment, some of these are very, very controversial. Other ones passed unanimously with both Republican and Democratic support in the legislature, like these issues to provide an additional homestead for spouses who lost a loved one in the line of duty and for senior citizens. So obviously no one is actively opposing them. The concern, however, is all of these are going to cut revenues. And right now Florida has a revenue issue, revenue crisis. So what you find is a lot of groups, school teachers, you find folks that provide services for seniors, services to the poor, police, fire departments. A lot of groups are concerned that this will further cut the tax base and it's going to result in some draconian cuts to public services.
I want to talk a little more about that. The last one on the ballot involves a student body president, number 12. Talk about that.
You know, I've got to say, I can't believe this is on the Constitution. This should be something solved by the legislature, but here's what it is. There is a board of governors that oversees our state university system, the 12 schools in our system. And right now there's 17 members of the board, and one of them is a student member. The current student member is the head of the Florida Student Association. What they want to do is they want to create a new body. The 12 presidents of the 12 state universities, and then whichever student chairs that body would then serve as the 17th member of the governing board.
Let's talk in toto about the amendments. The debate for and against these amendments. I've heard on one side, listen, we want to give the voters a chance, and by the way, these all need 60% voter approval.
Absolutely.
So it's a different bar, 60% voter approval. The legislators said, Republican-led,
right.
We want to give voters a chance to weigh in on contentious issues about taxes and everything else. Talk about that debate, and then let's talk about the other side that says the legislature is giving up its duty and wants to get off the hot seat by shoving this all on voters.
Well, one of the arguments is Florida's Constitution is much larger, much more complicated than the U.S. Constitution, significantly so. And one argument is that the state legislature perhaps is abandoning its legislative responsibility by turning all this over to voters. There's two ways to look at it, though, and I think both sides have a valid point. Number one, there's perhaps no more pure form of democracy than allowing citizens to push initiatives and for citizens to vote in the booth on such important issues. So the Florida legislature, the Republican-led legislature, has been making that argument.
Right.
On the other hand, the League of Women Voters has provided a blanket opposition to every one of these amendments, in part because they feel the Constitution is too unwieldy, and some of these things don't belong in the Constitution, they belong before the state legislature. Now, again, you're right, it requires a 60%. It's not a simple majority, 50% plus one. 60% of the voters to approve all these issues. The other controversy is this. There's several ways to amend a Constitution. You can have a constitutional convention. You could have citizens bring forth an initiative if they get 8% of all the votes cast and it's spread out among several different districts around the state. Or you can have the state legislature bring forward the constitutional amendment. One of the points of controversy is every one of these 11 issues has been brought forward by the state legislature.
And let's back up to perhaps, perhaps I shouldn't put it this way, but it's certainly one of the most contentious. It's about the Supreme Court justices and retention. We talked about it last week.
Yeah.
It bears repeating again. Go back to what that would do, the pros and cons of that very hot debate as it involves one of the branches of our Florida government.
Right. Supporters of this, it would essentially do...
This is amendment number?
Yeah. Here's what it would do. It would essentially provide two different high courts. One would deal with civil cases, one would deal with criminal cases. It would also allow the state legislature, the state Senate, to confirm appointments to the high bench, which is what we do at the U.S. level. We don't do it at the state level. It would also allow the state legislature some more access to documents that pertain to the court, and it would allow the state legislature to regulate the court. The state legislature argues that they should have more oversight and that this would, quote unquote, reform the high court.
And streamline it.
And streamline it
civil
because
and criminal divisions.
Right, because there's so many cases and such a backlog. Critics say it's upsetting this balance between executive, legislative, and judicial. It would give the legislative branch far too much power over the judicial branch, and the idea of two Supreme Courts is kind of an odd and quirky invention.
And has there not been a heated debate that the Republican-led legislature is trying to do an end run around a court that it doesn't like the makeup of by diluting its power?
Democrats are making the argument that you would split the court and you would have the justices that have been on the court longer go to one court and then new appointees go to the other court. While the justices that have been on the court longer were ones appointed by, Democrats, Bob Graham and Lawton Childs and so forth. So it would move the Democrats to a different court. They would have less responsibility, and it would allow Jeb Bush's appointees, current appointees under Rick Scott, to go to the more powerful court. It would also change, instead of having 7 or 9 justices, as we see with the U.S. Supreme Court, 5 and 5.
How slippery a slope, if I may ask you candidly for your opinion on this particular one, when you start looking at issues and amendments that could have some impact on the balance of power between the branches of government?
I'm old school here. I think the framers in a hot, humid summer in 1787 got it right in Philadelphia when they put our Constitution together, and that is less is more. Allow the Constitution to be an enduring, relevant document by having less information in there. Let us have vigorous debates and healthy civil debates about it. The longer a Constitution, the more specific it is, like Florida's, it tends to be unwieldy. I like the balance of executive, legislative, and judicial. I say don't tamper with it. That's my personal opinion, not WPTV5, of course, or folks that are on one side or the other on this. But again, I think both sides have legitimate arguments on every one of these amendments.
You don't go away. We're bringing in a familiar face, Brian Crowley, in just a moment. And thank you so much, Robert, for a thoughtful explanation over the last 2 weeks about these very important Florida constitutional amendments. And a reminder, you can read Robert's ballot in plain English summary on WPTV.com. I urge you to go to that site. It is an excellent review. Go to the featured stories section on our homepage.